you, Maurizio, and I also want to really thank the organizers. It's been an absolutely lovely time here. And I was just noticing it's actually 35 degrees in Ithaca too, so hey, it's exactly the same. So I also want to start out my talk with setting expectations realistically. And I'm doing what you're never supposed to do with a keynote address, and that is present work that's half-baked. Okay, so this is half-baked work. It's not done yet. You guys are going to help me finish it. And I also wanted to mention that I decided around 11 o'clock last night to change my talk entirely. This is a different talk. I would blame the pisco sours, except I didn't have any. So instead, I'm going to blame Maurizio because of an off-cam comment he says, well, I don't like decompositions. And my last talk was all about decomposition. So Maurizio, this is your fault if this is not a good talk. So what I want to present today is a little bit of work, some new work that's building on some older work that's really thinking about educational segregation by gender and its consequences for various labor market outcomes. This is some joint work I'm actually doing with Liu Pan, who is an undergraduate at Cornell. He is currently a sophomore. He is deciding between physics and sociology as his major. And I'm very much hoping that he goes for sociology. However, my probability expectation is exceedingly low. But he's an absolutely fabulous undergraduate who has been helping me with some of this research. Okay, so the first technical issue here. Do I need to do something with the? It should be. Which computer is, oh, there it is. Okay, so it's that one, not this one. Got it. So just to set the stage, I want to start out with a few social facts. They're probably going to be familiar with those of you who are somewhat familiar with the US labor market. This is a graph that's showing the extraordinarily slow integration of occupations by gender. So on the y-axis, we just have a very simple measure of index of dissimilarity. There are many, many, many ways that you can measure the extent to which men and women are unevenly distributed across occupations. I'm going to base a lot of the talk on the index of dissimilarity, mainly because it's very simple. I'll give you a formula about that later, but also because it's a measure that I find that you can actually explain to people who work outside of academia in a way that many of the others don't. But what this is essentially saying is that, well, this is really cool. It changed it into the European way, which means that I'm not going to be able to read the numbers and you guys are. I hope it didn't change everything else into Spanish, is just the key here. But essentially what this is saying is that among baccalaureate degree workers, so this is BA or higher degree workers in the dark blue line, in 1980, the index of dissimilarity is about 0.52, 0.53. Essentially what that's saying is that 53% of men would need to change into female-dominated occupations in order for all occupations to be integrated, or conversely, 53% of women would need to change into male-dominated occupations, right? So it's a symmetric measure. It ranges from 0 to 1. This graph happens to only go to 0.7, and it's essentially giving you an extent, a measure of the extent of the unevenness that there is. So a couple things to figure out about this graph. First of all, baccalaureate or higher degree workers tend to be less segregated occupationally in the labor market than the entire labor force, which is the dark gray and yellow lines up there at the top. And we also see younger workers tend to be less segregated than the full labor force as well, right? So I just have age 25 to 30 in the orange and the yellow bars, and then all workers in gray and BA or higher workers in blue. The other thing I want you to see, get out of this graph, is that there's very, very, very little change after 1990, right? So even though we know women's educational attainment has continued to acceleratingly exceed men, right? So women in the United States are now much more highly educated than men, particularly among the younger workers. We're not seeing this big change in occupational segregation. The second kind of social fact that I want to start with is the segregation of men and women across fields of study. So this is looking at only baccalaureate degree workers or higher, right? They're the only workers for whom it makes sense to talk about their field of study. And it's again, looking at trends over time, and I have two lines here. The orange line is all BA degree or higher workers, regardless of their age. And then the gray line is BA degree age 25 to 30. So again, those younger workers. What this is essentially saying, that you also notice that the graph starts in 2009 instead of 1980. This is because we don't have data prior to 2009 in the United States on field of study in these large nationally representative surveys. But what this is essentially showing you is, again, very, very, very little change in segregation across field of study between 2009 and 2022, particularly among all workers. But even if you look at the younger workers, there is an upward slope here to this trend, but it's not exactly taking off, right? We're not exactly seeing a decline. In fact, if anything, we're seeing an increase in the segregation of the younger workers. I also wanted to point out this little dot here. That's not a fly speck. That's 2022. The 2020 data are worthless. Okay, not quite, but almost. So therefore, a lot of the graphs that you're going to see are not going to include 2020 data because they are so absolutely bizarre. So this is a table that's trying to get a sense of some of the sources of this field of segregation, of occupational segregation. And it's basically trying to think about the hypothetical of what would segregation look like if men and women had the same racial distribution among workers, the same family status distribution of among workers, same age distribution, same education level, right? So they have BA, MA, professional, or PhD. Again, because this is all college-educated workers, the workers with primary education are not in the table. And then the final row here is adjusting for 173 fields of study. And a couple of take-home points. First of all, again, if you look across the row here, 1990 to 2021, 2022, we're seeing about a 5-point difference in the index of dissimilarity. That's about a 12% decline in occupational segregation across the past 32 years. Is that a lot? Is that a little? I tend to think of it as relatively little. But I also want you to notice, if you look down the columns here, you see essentially no effect of gender differences in race, in family status, in age, or in education level on the index of dissimilarity, right? So whatever is going on with occupational segregation, it does not have to do with differences across men and women in their family status, and it does not have to do with differences across men and women in their educational level, right? So this is, I'm emphasizing this a little bit because I think there's a tendency, partly because of data limitations, for us to just look at education level. The story here is that if we want to understand occupational segregation in the labor market, education level is not going to get you very far. By contrast, look at these last two periods here. If we add in measures of field of study, 173 fields of study, you can basically explain a little bit less than half of the occupational segregation, right? So in 2010, field segregation accounts for about 46% of occupational segregation. In 2021, it's about 40%. Those differences are not huge, right? We're dealing with percentages off of relatively small amounts of change. But the general point here is that field of segregation is very strongly associated with occupational segregation. A lot of this work comes from a paper with Haowen Zhang, who is a Cornell PhD student, and I, that we just published relatively recently in Demography. One of the things that it does, and maybe I should have given this talk instead, right? This is the talk that I didn't give, is it looks at the strength of linkage between fields and occupations and tries to understand occupational segregation as a function of linkage strength. And the intuition here is that when you have a field of study that has a very strong linkage to a particular set of jobs in the labor market, you tend to get stronger compositional effects, right? So if men are dominated in that field of study, that also translates into men dominating in those occupations in the labor market. But you also get kind of this offsetting coefficient effect as if you want to think about it in standard decomposition terms, that essentially the women who are getting jobs in sort of a very highly male-dominated, high linkage field of study, like say mechanical engineering, they tend to enter fairly male-dominated occupations, right? So it's really trying to show this how linkage strength kind of plays into occupational segregation. But that's not the paper I'm going to give you today. I did want to actually show you a little bit of a sense. Now we're digging down into the level of fields of study. And I've just given you two examples of the 173. On the left-hand side, we have mechanical engineering, which is, of course, a male-dominated field of study. On the right-hand side, we have our favorite, sociology, because it's the best discipline there is. Wow. I thought at least the economist would have the good grace to laugh at that. Essentially, what it's showing you here is that even given the same degree, the men and women are getting slightly different, are taking slightly different jobs. So on the left-hand side, mechanical engineering, the pink here shape is basically showing you the distribution of the percent female in the occupations that our female mechanical engineering majors are taking. And then the blue is the male mechanical engineering graduates and what sorts of occupations they're taking. Basically, the men are more likely to, or the average proportion female of the occupation that the male mechanical engineering grads are taking is lower than the women, right? And then conversely here in sociology, there are men who graduate in sociology still in the United States, increasingly rare breed, but nonetheless there are some. But they tend to be taking male-dominated jobs more than the women who are graduating in sociology, right? Basically, this is telling you a story about within-field occupational segregation, right? That the men and women are taking slightly different jobs, even given the same degree. What I want to do in this study is ratchet down the level of analysis yet further. It's a kind of a story of my career. Mauricio alluded to my work on class structure. I started out thinking about like big classes and then went to meso classes and then micro classes. Here I started out my career talking about big education levels, and now I'm going to field, and now I'm going to go drill down even further to the level of segregation of men and women across courses, across actual classes in one university that I happen to know quite well. But I also want to put gender segregation in the context of other forms of segregation across other status dimensions. And I think that'll become clearer here in a second. So first of all, what do I mean by course segregation? Basically, I want to look at the uneven distribution of men and women across courses. What classes are they taking after adjusting and before adjusting for major choice, right? We know that majors are going to be driving a lot of the courses that students are taking, but students, at least in the American context, still have quite a lot of choice about what courses they take, even beyond their major. So why should we care about course segregation? For the context of this conference, I think there is sort of assumption, and I've done this in some of my work as well, that as long as we know education level and field of study, we can kind of assume some sort of homogeneity of training among the people who get a given degree level in a given field of study. What this is saying is the course segregation question is really saying, well, how warranted is that assumption? Is it the case that the men who are getting mechanical engineering degrees and the women who are getting mechanical engineering degrees are actually taking the same courses beyond what they need for to fulfill their degree requirements? So there's kind of this idea that courses are the actual site of training and skill development that we tend to build into our models of gender inequality in labor markets in very explicit ways. And if we find a lot of segregation of students across courses, it implies that they may not actually be learning the same thing. They may not be coming out of college with the same knowledge and skills, even given their degree level and their major. So there's also a broader sociological background here that I wanted to just kind of put in a pitch for, partly so I've noticed that lots of people have put citations to work in the 2020s and whatnot. I decided to take the absolute opposite tack and show you who was first doing this stuff, right? So there's this intergroup contact hypothesis. It's often associated with Gordon Allport. It's often associated with Tom Pettigrew, but Robin Williams Jr., who is a sociologist at Cornell, actually got there 20 years earlier. The idea here is that if under certain conditions, the conditions being where you have relatively low in-group hierarchical status orders, where you have a common task, where you have some sort of rules of engagement The contact between members of different ethnic groups, which is what Robin Williams was most interested in, can lead to greater tolerance between those members of the different ethnic groups, right? So this is the intergroup contact hypothesis, basically trying to think about the context of small group settings. Arguably, classrooms can be those small group settings where you would tend to have social benefits to increasing contact across groups that are very different from each other demographically. We also know there's a vast literature starting with Jim Coleman in 1966 that is looking at how the composition, the demographic composition, class composition, racial composition, so forth of your peers, and including those who are in your classroom, affect your own learning outcomes, right? So we might think about, we might be interested in the extent to which classes are homogeneous with respect to some dimension, whether it's race or gender or international status, because it affects the learning of everybody in those classes, right? That's the argument that people put forth. There's also a literature, and it comes out of the organization's work, and Rosabeth Moth Cancer in 1977, was really talking about the harms of being a token, as she put it. That's kind of old-fashioned language at this point, but basically being the only one of a particular demographic group can be extraordinarily harmful to that person's career, to inter-organizational dynamics and so forth. Idea, again, coming out of Rosabeth Moth Cancer's work. And then, of course, more recently, there's this vast discussion going on, particularly in the United States, about the role of universities in perpetuating inequalities of various sorts, but possibly also mitigating inequalities of various sorts. You see this especially in the conversation right now in the United States about the end of race-conscious admissions, which is just this last summer in the Supreme Court decision, right? So lots of reasons why we might care about diversity in the classroom. So then we might ask, well, why might students be segregated across courses? And I could kind of, sociologists are really good about telling stories after the fact, and I'm going to do that here, right? This is an exercise in storytelling. And I'm going to give you 6 reasons, I think, here. One of which is simply spillover from academic tracking in high schools, right? So we know that men and women tend to take different courses in high school. Different racial groups tend to take different courses, even if they're on the college prep track. Like Liu Pan, my co-author, I'm sure took advanced physics in high school. But somebody else who went to Cornell may not have taken advanced physics in high school. And that's, of course, linked in part to social class and what sorts of classes are available to you in your high school. But nonetheless, we might think that if students are coming into college with different levels of, say, math or science preparation, they're going to be segregated into different courses in college as well. So that's sort of a straightforward spillover effect from academic tracking in high school. We might also think that there are real group-linked interests in content. So on occasion, I teach a course on gender inequality. I can say that the gender balance in a course on gender inequality is probably 85% women and 15% men at best. And it's because men don't have a gender, right? It's only women who have a gender, and so therefore they're the only ones who are interested in a course on gender inequality. I'm being facetious again, but the point here is that there are demographically linked differences in interests, and in a high choice environment where students can choose their classes, they're going to affect to courses that are of interest to them, right? And so that could create demographic segregation across courses simply by virtue of these prior differences in interests and tastes. We also know, I'm being a little bit naive perhaps about how it is that students choose courses and thinking that they might choose courses that they need to take or that they're interested in. We also know that students choose courses because their friends are in courses, right? There is a certain benefit if you're taking a 9 a.m. class to having a really good friend with whom you can alternate actually attending your 9 a.m. class, right? Because we know that friendships tend to be homophilous with respect to race and ethnicity and social class and gender, you might also anticipate that courses are going to be homophilous with respect to those attributes. There could be preference for instructors like me. So particularly students from racialized minority backgrounds or sexual orientation minority backgrounds might want to take classes from professors who they think understand their life experiences, right? So there could be some sort of a segregation effect that's going on because of preference for particular sorts of instructors. It could be that there's segregation that occurs because some demographic groups, for example, women may feel less welcome in STEM courses. They may feel like it's a chilly climate for them. They may want to just avoid this place where they're feeling like they're not welcome, right? So, and that will also tend to create demographic segregation. And there could be this avoidance of being the only one, the token, if you will. So it could be that students feel if they're the only member of, say, a racialized minority group or a gender group, that they have to kind of represent their entire group. That's a very, very stressful situation for students. So they may choose to sort of opt out of those courses where they find themselves the token simply because that's such an uncomfortable position to be in. Here we might make a distinction between a visible status, or what Cecilia Ridge may call a master status, and more of an invisible status. And here I'm thinking about gender presentation and racial presentation tend to be much more visible things than whether you're a domestic or an international student or whether you come from a very wealthy background or a less wealthy background. I'm not saying that those other things are completely invisible, but it takes a little while, particularly when you're talking about college students who all tend to dress in sweatpants anyway, right? That the class cues are not necessarily all that strong, at least to begin with, right? So we might think that there's more avoidance of being a token on the dimensions of gender or race than there would be on class and domestic versus international status. So now that I've gone through this big story, I'm going to do absolutely none of those things, right? And the reason why is because I can't. I'll talk about a little bit more what I can and can't do with the data here in a second. I might eventually be able to test the instructor concordance hypothesis, but right at the moment I can't. The rest of them I have no clue, right? What I can do is look at the extent to which field segregation across courses is tied to your major, right? So I do know the student's major. I also know the level that they are in school. The college major thing is a little bit tricky though, because there is the potential, at least in American universities, of reverse causality, right? You decide to major in something because you're interested in the classes you took, as opposed to deciding to major in something prior to being admitted into a college and then taking the courses because they're required for your major, right? So I am not making a causal claim here, it's just an associational claim, as I tend to do. So what I want to do in the rest of my time is try to give you a very, very descriptive sense of the extent to which we have either courses that are demographically homogeneous, so courses that are all women, courses that are all men, courses that are all white Americans, and so forth. But I also want to talk about that from the student perspective. So throughout the first couple of presentations of results, I'm going to give you both course level analyses, so what share of courses are demographically homogeneous, and also which students and how often are students spending their class time with students who are all exactly like them, right? So demographically homogeneous from the student perspective. Similarly, I want to know how many courses, what share of courses have this issue of a demographic isolate, having one person who is quote unquote representing a group. And I also want to know how common of an experience that is for different groups of students. So how often do students find themselves as the only Black American student in a classroom, the only woman in a science class, and so forth? And then I want to broaden back out to the kind of the system level and think about segregation and sort of apply some of these segregation indices as well and get a sense of how much segregation there is across courses, how much of it is tied to major and field segregation, and this question about whether students are actually becoming more or less segregated as they proceed through their educational careers. Okay, data. So I have data from a single university. While I'm drinking water, you can guess which university it is. That's the view from my office. I'm lying. That's a view from a drone. I do actually have a view that looks this way, but I look at the administration building, which isn't nearly so fun. So the data come from a single university that may or may not be Cornell. Cornell may or may not have 11 roughly independent colleges. Cornell is I've had conversations with administrators. They like to think of it as unique. I like to think of it as bizarre. It turns out there's a fine line between bizarre and unique. But Cornell does have, it's a private institution, but it has public colleges. So some of the colleges are under contract with New York State, which means it is essentially the agricultural school for the state of New York. If you want to major in plant and soil sciences, you can at Cornell. You can also major in philosophy, right? So it's sort of this mix of a liberal arts university and a land-grant university. I do have complete-ish enrollment data from spring of 2023, so last semester, where I have data on every student and every course in which they are enrolled in spring of 2023. I say ish because students are allowed to opt out of faculty research, but fortunately only 3% of students actually say, no, I don't want to be part of faculty research on Cornell data. And I actually know exactly what classes they're taking, even though they opted out. I don't know anything about them. I don't know their gender. I don't know their race, but I do know which classes they're in. And it turns out that that 3% is pretty evenly distributed across all 7,008, not that I know this off the top of my head, but all 7,008 courses at Cornell. So I'm not too concerned about the 3% missing data. So just a few words of terminology here, a little bit more about the data. I am looking at courses that are taught on the Ithaca campus only. Ithaca, Cornell has a campus in New York City. That's where its med school is. It has little floaty bits all over the place. Cornell is actually the largest private landholder in the state of New York, which, when you think about it, I mean, that's pretty expensive real estate, right? So it's a real estate with like some classes attached to it. Real estate hedge fund with some classes attached to it. I'm just looking at the courses that are taught in Ithaca and in person. So all of our courses have now gone back to being in person after the pandemic. I am treating what we call secondary components as if they are different classes. So at Cornell, it's very common for students to take a large lecture and then to have discussion sections that go along with it. So I happen to teach a 250 student course on inequality. And then there are 10 sections that are each roughly about 25 students each, right? So I'm treating those sections as if they're separate courses, partly because they really affect the student's experience. In fact, it's those discussion sections where they may actually feel their tokenism a little bit more than in a large lecture. So there are 7,008 unique courses. I will filter that down. Some of the things that Cornell calls courses are independent studies and whatnot, and eventually I'm going to get those out of the data because they're arguably not real courses. I also have student self-reported demographic data. I'll show you what those are in the next slide when I get to the descriptive statistics. I know the university's categorization of the student is whether they're international or domestic, right? So the university actually keeps good records on that, go figure. I know their major or their field. There are 139 possibilities at Cornell. You cannot major in underwater basket weaving, but anything else that you might imagine you can major in at Cornell. And I also know their level in the program. So this is, I hope this is legible. I tried to increase the size of the font right before the talk here, but this is giving you some basic demographic descriptives about Cornell University, what it looks like. So like virtually all American universities, there's now a higher share of students who are women than who are men. I also wanted to flag here, I thought this was interesting, only 0.2% of the students refused to answer the gender question. So this is self-identified gender, but Cornell does not give the students a non-binary option. I assumed that I would get a lot higher percentage than 0.2 with no answer, but I ended up with only 0.2% no answer. You can see the racial distribution there. It's about 1/3 white students, 1/3 Asian students, a little bit less than 1/3 of this group that I'm going to call underrepresented minority. These are Black, Hispanic, Native American, Hawaiian Pacific Islander, that's HPI, and multiracial students. I also have about 16% of the students who do not have an answer on the race question. The vast majority of those students are international students. for whom the reporting in the United States about race and ethnicity is a little bit different, and also graduate students. And so part of it is that the graduate students are sometimes coming in to Cornell in ways that they don't need to fill out the same forms. I have international domestic status, and I also have a kind of a crude indicator of parental socioeconomic status, basically whether the student has at least one parent who has a baccalaureate degree, who has a college degree, or not, right? And so this is giving you the distribution. The first column here is the percentage of all students. The second column is the percentage of undergraduates. The undergraduates tend to be relatively evenly distributed with respect to the gender, slightly higher shares of underrepresented minority students among the undergraduates than among the graduate students. And the undergraduates also tend to be much more likely to be domestic students, USA students, as opposed to international students. They also tend to be more likely to be first generation than among the graduate students, which is very, very consistent with what we know about educational stratification in the United States. I should also say Cornell is, it likes to think of itself as an Ivy. I guess technically it is, but it is a very highly selective university. It's not Harvard levels of selectivity, it's not Yale levels of selectivity, but it's less than 10% of the students who are coming in, right? And I think we're seeing part of that reflected in the parental education distributions and so forth. Okay, so let's get to some results here. In terms of demographic heterogeneity or homogeneity, first I want to talk about the share of students that are enrolling, students from just one demographic group, and then I want to flip to talking about the students' experiences of being in homogeneous courses. I should point out that, of course, this is going to be affected by the size of the group, right? If you are an underrepresented minority student and your entire group represents 9% of the population, you are much more likely to find yourself being in a class where you are the only person from that group, right? So this idea of both homogeneity and isolationism is definitely affected by relative size of groups. There are ways that you can adjust segregation indices to account for this, and I'll show you some of those later on. But I just want to think about the experience that our students are actually having at Cornell in terms of the demographic composition of their classes. Okay, so first set of results here. You guys can read them because they have you have the little comma there instead of the period. I don't know what that says. But if you wanted to, what I've done here, the blue bars are percentage of students or percentage of courses that have no students of that particular group. So if you look up here for men, about 17%, that's the width of the blue bar, about 17% of these 7,008 courses have no men in them. About 10.8% of our classes have all men in them, or conversely, no women in them, right? So if you add the blue bar and the orange bar together, you get the share of courses at Cornell that are entirely homogeneous with respect to gender, whether it's because they're all men or it's because they're all women. And of course, that roughly works out to about 28% of the courses are either all men or all women. I don't want to focus too much on the rest of these dimensions because it is supposed to be a talk about gender segregation, and I am cognizant of the time. But throughout, you're going to see a lot more homogeneity and isolationism with respect to race than you are with respect to gender, partly because of the marginal distributions of those groups, right? There are just a lot smaller shares of underrepresented minority students at Cornell, for example, than there are shares of men or shares of women. That's roughly evenly balanced, more or less. So what I've done here on the right-hand side is excluded, so this on the left-hand side is all courses. On the right-hand side, what I've done is excluded any course that has fewer than 5 students and any course that is essentially an independent study or a research course, right? So I've tried to limit the courses on the right-hand side to being kind of regular courses. And of course, what you see is that the share of entirely homogeneous courses drops way down. With respect to gender, we're getting about, I think it's about 3% of courses are either entirely male or entirely female, right? So the share of entirely demographically homogeneous courses drops way down when you exclude those research-based courses, those independent studies. I do that with a little bit of trepidation because it is true that this is part of this Cornell student experience to be in these small research-based courses where there aren't very many other students, right? But I did want to kind of also show you what happens when you trim off the very, very small courses. We get a lot more homogeneity with respect to some of these other types of groups. For example, this one here is saying that almost 30% of courses have no Black students in them at Cornell, right? Just to help you read that, a little bit less than 20% have no international students in them. And then first gen, we have about 15% of classes have no first gen students in them. Okay, so now let's shift gears and talk about the student experience. The interpretation here is taking the student perspective. What this is saying is that 4.8% of men have at least one of their courses in which all of the students are men, right? So 4.8, a little bit less than 5% of our men are taking at least one course where there's nothing but men. And about 9% of women are taking courses where it's all women in the course, okay? Again, this is all types of students, regardless of the type of course that they're taking. There are about 22,617 students, more or less, at Cornell. If we trim that down, again, now I'm getting rid of these research courses and these small independent courses. You can see how this changed. First of all, notice the scale here, but we're essentially seeing a decline for both men and women in the share of students who are in these entirely homogeneous courses. However, there's still some, right? So we still have about 2% of our men, 3% of our women, more or less, are still taking at least one class that's more than 5 students where it's all women or it's all men, okay? So what about this experience of isolation, which Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, among other people, have told us is perhaps especially consequential for the students? Again, I want to give you a little bit of data about the courses and then talk about the share of students who have at least one course in which they are a demographic isolate. So here, I've given you a little bit of, I changed the key on you a little bit. Perhaps I should have chosen different colors. Here, the blue indicates the numeric majority at the university. So women are the numeric majority at Cornell University. Men are the numeric minority at Cornell University. And essentially what this is saying is that 16% of courses have just one man in it, and 18% have just one woman in them. All right, so again, we're seeing that there are quite a few courses at Cornell where there is at least somebody who is having this experience of being a demographic isolate with respect to one dimension, right? Of course, people they have a gender, they have a racial identity, they have a domestic international status. I'm not looking at intersectionality. My data are just not that prevalent to be able to look at intersectionality. But 17%, or 17% on average of both men and women are in these, 70% of courses are have just one man, 18% have just one woman. Then again, to trim off the small courses, what we see here, quite a shift. 5% of courses have just one man in them, about 2.1% have just one woman in it, right? So not a lot of courses actually have this complete demographic isolation, at least with respect to gender. If you think about demographic isolation with respect to race, there's a much more common for courses to have demographic isolation with respect to race and to first-gen status. Okay, and then finally, just to wrap up this particular bit of the description, this is looking at the share of students who are having these experiences of being the only one within at least one of their classes, right? Again, I'm just going to focus on the right-hand bar in the interest of time, the right-hand graph in the interest of time. It's a little bit, very small. It's a little bit less than 1% of men, and similarly, less than 1% of women actually have this experience of being a demographic isolate in at least one of their classes. there's a lot more segregation with respect to race, a lot more of this experience of being a demographic isolate, at least with respect to race. Okay, so that's just giving you a snapshot, just looking at classes and the extent to which students are actually having this experience of being in a class that either everybody is like them or no one else is like them. What I want to do now is turn to some of these more common kind of system-wide indicators of the extent to which men and women and other status groups are segregated across courses. There is a massive literature in sociology. I call them the segregation wars. It's a really old literature. It's really boring. I've participated in it myself. I'm not proud to admit it, but it is nonetheless, it turns out to not be terribly useful in many ways to engage in these index wars. I'm going to present to you a little bit of data on 3 different indices. The first 2 are measures of evenness of the distribution of men and women, for example, across courses. The final one here is more a measure of exposure. The final one is asymmetric, right? So if a white student's probability of being in a classroom with a black student is different from a black student's probability of being in a course with a white student, right? Because they're different size groups. If the groups were the same size, we wouldn't have that issue. But this is, so basically just ways to think about and characterize the overall level of segregation across courses. I do want to say that there's a little bit of a complexity here. Anybody who's worked with segregation indices knows that when you start to have a lot of really small units and not a lot of people, you basically get this problem where noise aggregates up and creates this appearance of segregation that doesn't actually exist. Or it does exist, but it's basically driven by random allocation. D is particularly susceptible to this problem of small unit bias. So there are fancy ways to deal with this problem, and then there's the unsophisticated way to deal with this problem. I chose the unsophisticated way to deal with this problem. And basically, I ran 1,000 keeping the marginal distributions, but then just randomly allocating, and then calculating D 1,000 different times, because that just sounds like a lot of fun, and basically coming up with sort of the amount of bias that there is in D because of this small unit problem. And then I subtracted that from the observed level of D. So on these graphs, just focusing on the one here for gender, this dotted line is the observed level of D is the hypothetical level of D that you would see under random alone, right? It actually turns out the bias adjustment for gender is not as extreme as the bias adjustment for, say, race. This is underrepresented minority versus white segregation. A little over half of the observed segregation is probably due to chance alone. Who want to study that form of segregation. You want on this right-hand column, and essentially what this is saying is that 14.3% of the male students would need to change into a female-dominated course in order for all courses to have the same gender representation. Or conversely, again, it's a symmetric measure, so you could say that 14.3% of women need to move into male-dominated courses, right? It's giving you a sense of the overall level of segregation. The level of gender segregation is actually fairly comparable with a lot of the measures of racial and ethnic segregation. So men and women pairwise comparisons. There are other measures where you could play around with where you have multiple group segregation, but I'm not going to deal with those right at the moment. But essentially, this 14.3% kind of falls in between the segregation of underrepresented minority students versus all other students, but it's a little bit less than the segregation of Asian versus white students at Cornell. So if you're thinking about, if there's one dimension of segregation at Cornell that really stands out, it's the segregation of domestic students from international students. Part of that is driven by the graduate students who tend to be more international, and they don't tend to take the undergraduate courses, go figure. And then there's relatively little segregation by parental education at Cornell, about 10%, more or less. I did promise you a few other indices. I just wanted to show you this table because, look, I did all that work. Essentially, what I want you to see here, just kind of looking at these measures of exposure, nicely illustrating this concept of asymmetry in the segregation indices, right? So our underrepresented minority students, these are Black, Hispanic, Native American, Hawaiian Pacific Islander, and multiracial students are much less likely to be, or much more likely to be exposed to a white student than a white student is to be exposed to an underrepresented minority student, right? And finally, or two more little bits of descriptive information here. One is I wanted to get a sense of the extent to which segregation is driven by major choice, right? So if driven by major choice, then maybe our indicators of field of study that we have popularized by demographer Mark Fawcett in 2017, who unfortunately recently passed away. Basically, he figured out, he was advocating for moving the study of segregation indices, which is typically done with aggregate level data, to an individual level model. And the benefit of that is that you can then stick it in a very familiar regression framework, and you do all sorts of decompositions, which Mauricio hates, and so forth. But essentially what I'm doing here, I'm just going to focus on D in the interest of time and simplicity. Essentially, I'm creating an individual level measure of whether a person is in a male-dominated field or course or not. That's the flag. And then I'm running a very simple linear probability model where I'm regressing that flag indicator of whether the person is in a segregated field of study, segregated course or not. So I have to ratchet my own discussion down levels. On regressing that on a group indicator, so whether they're male or not, but you can also control for other sorts of variables in this regression context. And so that's the beauty of the method, is that you can then recover D under the assumption of an even distribution of, say, men and women across majors, across racial and ethnic groups, and so forth. So the key predictor here that I wanted to answer, D, we would observe if men and women, for example, had the same distribution across fields of study. The answer here is that between 27% and 42% of the observed segregation that we saw across courses is really associated with students' majors. Right, so it's doing, major is capturing a little bit more than a third, but a little bit less than half. What do we make of this? If all you have is field of study, by all means use it, but don't assume that it's really accurately capturing the types of courses that students are taking beyond the major in particular. Okay. And then the final question that I have data about, or that I can bring data to bear on, is this idea that perhaps students' experience as they proceed through their college careers is changing. Why might that happen? First of all, we might think that there's more specialization as students get older. They tend to take more and more specialized the extent that you have gender segregation across majors early on. You could have the situation where when they first arrive at university, they tend to make friends with whoever they're roommates with. But then eventually they start to kind of sort into friendship groups that are themselves homophilous. And because they tend to take courses with their friends, that could create more segregation as the students age and so forth. The alternative here is that students procrastinate their gen ed requirements. As somebody who teaches a lower division sociology course that satisfies a gen ed requirement, I can say that that happens quite a lot. I have, out of those 250 students, I'm gonna have quite a few seniors who should not be in the class, but nonetheless, they need to fill a gen ed distribution requirement in the social sciences. And for whatever reason, they procrastinated. I don't understand why. But you could also have, unfortunately, the situation where the more advanced courses, because they tend to be smaller, they're also gonna have more noise in D. So this is the last graph that I'm going to show you here. You can focus if you want on the gender side of things. The left-hand column is all students, so this is a very familiar number at this point. The second one is just looking at undergraduates, first year, sophomore, junior, senior, graduate students, and then professional students. I hesitate to use a causal arrow in an audience that has economists in it, but you can think about this as a sort of a crude linear slope coefficient. It is showing, at least in the unadjusted D, some increase in segregation as the students age. But then when you do this trick of adjusting for D or adjusting for the noise in D, that pretty much wipes out, right? So I can't make a strong conclusion that, in fact, students are becoming more segregated as they age, because it doesn't seem to still obtain once I do this adjustment for random noise. Okay. So just a summary of the results. I've thrown a lot of graphs at you just to kind of give you a big picture here. About 28% of all courses, 3% of non-research courses of 5 or more students have either no men or no women, right? So it tends to be that demographic homogeneity is really happening in those very small research-focused courses. We have about 10% of students have the experience of being a gender isolate, but again, that drops way down when you kind of exclude the very small courses. And then we have these overall measures of segregation. About 14% of women would need to change to a male-dominated class to fully integrate all classes. I think there's a methodological lesson here, and that is, if you study segregation, you need to pay attention to the small unit bias. At least in the occupational segregation world in which I typically operate, we ignore it. The residential segregation people are much better about it. We tend to ignore it. I'm saying we shouldn't. A lot of about the men and I promised that I was going to give you a half-baked paper, and this is the half-baked paper. The half-bakedness is all here in the details about what the next steps are. One of the things that I can do, I have actually 5 snapshots of data throughout the semester, and I can look at students and their actual decisions about whether to stay in or transfer out of a class. Cornell has a very, very long add drop period. Students can continue to be fluctuating their classes like a third of the way through the semester, which as an instructor is kind of a pain. But nonetheless, they can do that. And one of the things that I can test is whether those students who find themselves as a demographic isolate in a section, for example, are more likely to change to a different section, right? Are they avoiding this experience of being a demographic isolate? I also just last week got instructor data. I always knew who the instructors were, but I actually got data from HR that is kind of indicates the instructor's race and their gender, right? So I can look at that and their international status. It turns out Cornell pays a lot of attention to visa issues too. So I can kind of get a little bit of a sense of this idea that students are cathecting to instructors who are like them demographically. I hope someday to be able to address this question of elective versus required courses. This is an actual live shot of the registrar staff wrangling course requirements data. So I did mention there are 11 colleges and 139 different majors. Every single one of them has not only different requirements, but like a different system for recording requirements. Some of it's just like a piece of paper that they hand to the first year students. Anyway, it drives the registrar's office nuts. They have no idea which courses fulfill what requirements. They're trying to get that data for me. Maybe they will at some point. I think one of the more interesting kind of next steps of this project is to use some natural language processing to process the course descriptions, right? So all instructors have to publish course descriptions. And I can get a little bit better sense of what it is that those students are supposedly learning in the courses that are highly demographically homogeneous or not. And then finally, I have been extraordinarily fortunate to get data from Cornell. If you think about this, this is pretty extraordinary for a university to actually release this data to little old me. I would love to be able to do this in other types of universities, not only within the American system, but also in systems where students have a lot less choice about what sorts of courses they take. Okay, are there implications very, very quickly here? Are there implications for gender equality research? I do think that there's some evidence coming out of Cornell, at least, that men and women are not, in fact, taking the same classes even after you control for major, right? We're thinking about this from a skill acquisition. We really want to know how comparable are those women mechanical engineers to the male mechanical engineers in terms of the skills that they have at least been exposed to in classes. And we also don't yet know the extent to which any of this actually matters for course taking patterns or for the personal experiences of the students, right? So I talk a lot to Liu, who's an undergraduate who's living this stuff, and he says, well, yeah, you know, I notice when I'm the only Asian student in the class, but I don't really care, right? So it could be that I'm going through this whole exercise and it doesn't actually affect the students as much as I might think it does. Of course, Liu is an extraordinary student as well. So he's a little bit older than most sophomores, so his experience may not, in fact, mimic other students' experience. Okay, are there policy implications for universities? I think there are, and one of the things that I see, particularly in the context of American discussions about higher education, enormous focus on diversity, equity, inclusion right at the moment, right, for obvious reasons. A lot of that tends to very much focus on the question of how we get more diverse student populations coming to a university. But there's very little attention to what it is that they do when they're there, right? So the focus is really on admissions, 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 and getting a pipeline of a diverse student body, but not a whole lot kind of even thinking about the extent to which students are actually interacting with each other in the classroom setting across these socio-demographic lines. And there also tends to be a lot of special programming targeted at very specific groups, but again, without kind of paying a whole lot, digging deep into what it is that the students are actually doing. Women in STEM is a great example. I call this science with a sparkle. It kind of annoys me. We shouldn't necessarily need you know, to sparkle up our STEM classes to make them more attractive to women. But there is a lot of that type of focus without kind of really thinking about the structural aspects of inequality across gender lines that's going on at the course level. There's also a question, I think, particularly with respect to racial diversity in higher education, about the extent to which universities can monitor but also manage course segregation in a very intentional way. Universities have much less control over students than people outside the university think they do. I mean, you see this currently in all kinds of discourse about politics. There's this kind of this assumption that universities have a lot of control over students. It turns out that they don't have a lot of control over students, but one of the things that they can do is manage the structure of requirements, manage the structure of kind of the educational experience in a way that could decrease segregation or decrease isolation or decrease homogeneity within courses. And I've just given you a few examples here. If it is the case that students are much more likely to be exposed to students who are different from them in the gen ed requirements, make more gen ed requirements, right? It's a very unpopular take. The pressure is always toward more and more and more specialization, but universities could say, no, instead of taking 10 courses outside your major, you have to take 20 courses outside your major. It would be unpopular, but they could do it. We could disincentivize double majoring, right? If majors are one of the reasons why students are kind of segregating into courses, you could say, well, you can have one major, but after that, you can't have more than one major. You can also do more strategic course enrollment. Here I just wanted to highlight that in some sense there's a trade-off between reducing segregation across courses and isolation. In the process of reducing segregation of courses, you may increase isolation, particularly of the smaller demographic groups. So here, I'm going to end with this. This is a quote from a National Public Radio story, came out this summer, of course, part of the massive amounts of discourse about the end of race-conscious admissions in American higher education. But this is a quote from somebody who was acting dean at Berkeley, California. I saw CA actually appeared in somebody else's slide, and I think it meant Columbia. It's like, no, not Columbia, California, a little bit different. So she was acting dean at Berkeley when California eliminated race-conscious admissions, which was much earlier than the recent federal Supreme Court case. Was it 1997? Was it that early? Doesn't matter, a while ago. And she was basically saying that one of the things that she advocated and got permission to do was essentially cluster the Black American students into certain subset of courses so they didn't experience isolation. But you think about this, this is increasing segregation even as it's reducing isolation. But this is another thing that universities could, in theory, do, is really actively manage enrollments in the classroom to try to meet particular educational goals. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. I look forward to your comments. This is Oxford, yeah.
Hi. So very interesting data and findings. So my guess is that one very simple policy to decrease would be increase the number of students per class. Right, that's probabilistically that would reduce the likelihood of being isolated. So that seems like you may have an important trade-off there with the quality of the instruction, right? So that's another issue that maybe pose even a more complicated problem for educational authorities if segregation is really an important issue.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. So in my class of 250 students, I guarantee you that, I mean, approximately 25% are first-gen students, approximately 40% are students of color, because it's a sociology course. There are very few men. Men are actually becoming the minority group within a sociology of inequality course. But you're right, it's absolutely true that yes, there's demographic diversity in my course. It's also 250 students and they're not really interacting with each other. I mean, I try to have them interact, but it's hard in a class that large. So I think you're absolutely right. That's another trade-off that I think universities really need to think about. I mean, my suspicion in the American context in particular, universities are graded by the number of small classes that they have, right? So there's a huge pressure not to just increase class sizes because that will damage their US News and World Report's ranking, right? Which, I mean, administrators, they never admit to caring about that, but then whenever Cornell goes up like half a point on, yay, you know, but yeah, you're absolutely right that the large courses are going to be more diverse, but have other trade-offs for sure, yeah.
So I wonder if you can correlate this with how tough the class is. So grades, average grades, or requirements, which might be prerequisites, might be another thing. And in general, do you think that this is in part pre-med, pre-law kind of thing? So we both finish with the same degree, but one of us has the plan of going towards a different type of graduate degree, while women might be finishing with chemistry, men might be doing chemistry to enter pre-med or med later.
Yeah. I have done a lot of work on sort of occupational plans and how that affects major choice, college major choice. It turns out that that's the single biggest predictor of college major choice. I mean, maybe this isn't a surprise to anybody, but I think that's right. Cornell is, perhaps a little bit of a unique context in the sense that we don't have a pre-med or pre-law degree. They get their degrees in something else. I think I heard, though, that like something like 50% of the incoming students want to be doctors when they come into Cornell, and then they change their mind. They take organic chemistry and they change their mind in a hurry, right? So, you know, I mean, I think that there is certainly some tracking that's going on. There's also peer pressure that's going on in terms of what you're going to do with your degree and which courses you're taking. I could get at that. I think the course descriptions and the natural language processing, I'm actually a little bit less skeptical that I'm ever going to get anything useful out of the registrar's office in terms of the fulfilling requirements, because it's such a mess of a data. I mean, it's really astonishing how bad it is. They've been delightful, but you know, but yes, you're absolutely right that what I don't have here is the students' occupational plans and what they're intending to do even after Cornell. Some of them are going to go on, some of them are not, you know, and I can't tell the difference. Maurizio.
Thanks for the presentation, Kim. Very, very interesting. So I have more than a question about the possible follow-up. So you started with a graph showing, if I remember correctly, what people do in relationship to what people major in by gender, right?
Yes,
so
well, sort of, yeah.
Would it be possible to, so I imagine that Cornell does some sort of survey to alumni. So would it be possible to try to explain the fact that people, even people who who graduate from the same major actually end up in different occupations by linking the course taking behavior to what they actually do? Because you show that, yeah, about 2/3 of the course segregation is not due to major, right? It was something like that?
It's yeah, a little bit less
A
than
little bit
2/3.
less than
Yeah,
that. Okay,
yeah.
so that means that basically they have people with same major have vastly different training. And if that systematically varies in ways that links men and women or people of different races differently to the labor market, that would be a very interesting contribution.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to be a little bit careful here in that I have so far not looked at the courses that are different, right? So it could be, we have these things at Cornell, they're called freshman writing seminars, and they're small groups, they're 15 students or so, and the first year students all have to take one. And 99% of them are taught in the humanities because it's how they fund the humanities graduate students. I'm being a little bit cynical, but not entirely. But you know, a student like my son happened to take one on medieval philosophy. He's a biology major. He took one on medieval philosophy. His friend might have taken one on romance in the 20th century. Those are going to be different courses, but ideally, I mean, in theory, the training is all about the writing, not about the content, right? So it could be that they're in different courses, but the content is actually similar. I mean, I like the hypothesis.
But the NLP thing you were planning will help you with that.
Yes. Yes, looking at the course descriptions. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Saying, I don't hate the compositions, only the KHAP.
You only hate the ones that we're trying to do?
Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. So first I wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about the small courses, because it seems like that's a huge effect happening there. And I'm not familiar, like I know the grad kind of classes that are like that, but what are those undergrad classes? And if you have any ideas on what may be happening there?
Yeah. So I can certainly separate out the grad courses from the undergraduate courses. I didn't want to show you a bazillion more graphs, but I do have them by undergraduate only, which you might say that that's kind of where the interesting action is anyway. The undergraduates who are taking these, they're primarily taking independent studies. they're primarily doing honors theses. So they do sign up for a class to do an honors thesis, but it's basically a class where they're the only student and they meet with their advisor individually, right? So some of it's going to be that. Some of it is going to be kind of real classes, but it just happen to be very small. So some of the less commonly taught language courses can be that small. So for example, Cornell offers a degree in Czech language. There are not very many students who want to take Czech languages. So those courses tend to be very, very small. Some of the music performance courses tend to be quite small. Art studio courses can be that way. So, in some sense, they are spaces where students are interacting, but they're kind of not the same as a course where somebody is standing up and saying, well, hey, what did you think about Marx's theory of capital, whatever. I mean, we don't do that in America, but if we did, right? Yeah.
About teachers, right? About instructors. Yeah.
I am in the data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially, you can test like several hypotheses, which are very, like mainstream in terms of explaining the leaky pipeline, for instance. Yeah, I'm saying the Chile climate hypothesis, and that route basically seems very, fruitful for the future research.
Yeah. Cornell has already agreed to allow me to track the same students over time, so I can actually get data to see whether experiences as being an isolate, for example, reduce the probability that they stay within STEM. So I can test that eventually. It'll take a while for that spring 2023 cohort to kind of move through. The good news is that nobody flunks out of Cornell, so. Or the bad news is nobody flunks out. Somebody asked me a question about grades, by the way. So the grading, we spend a lot of time at Cornell grading, but you might as well just like all the humanities, everybody gets an A. All the social sciences, everybody gets an A- or B+, and all the STEM fields, everybody gets a C, right? So, we could save a lot of time and effort by just doing that, yeah. And economics, everybody flunks. I'm kidding. Tanya, did you have something else you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, well, I had like to talk about the following on the time, kind of following the idea of the STEM method, right? But I also wanted to ask about how much of a real free choice students have to take these classes. But I always say since my niece was taking classes at the beginning of the semester, and I saw how crazy the whole thing was in terms of like who gets, priority to take the class, what requirements you have to have, even as a freshman. So there might be something happening there, or
Yeah. At Cornell, it varies by college, but the general system is that older students have priority in enrolling. You pre-enroll for courses, and the older students get first shot, and then it goes down. So the freshmen constantly get locked out of my course, even though it's an introductory course, because the seniors who delayed their gen ed requirements take all the spots, right? Cornell's computer system is not smart enough to prevent that, right? So in some sense, you kind of have this situation. It is also, at Cornell may also be a unique situation in that students can over-enroll in courses. So they can enroll in like 7 different courses at the beginning of the semester, even if they only want to take 5. So they enroll in 7 and they drop the 2 that they don't like the most. So there's not kind of a formal system of priority unless, an instructor would have to do that on their own, and most instructors don't. Right, so I don't want to manage a wait list of 250 students for my class. I'd rather just have first come, first serve. So, I think that there is some locking out that happens at Cornell. It's probably much less than it is at a bigger state school. And there's this weird shopping period where everybody's sort of moving around and floating around, and you never really know who's in your class. And eventually it all settles out after week 2 or 3. And then there's the emails. I got locked out. Can you let me in? That. Yeah. I love students, I really do. That sounded pretty snotty. Thank you. Sorry.